This presentation will look at the implications of peak oil, summarize our most recent study, look at the implications for oil imports, develop some findings, conclusions, caveats, questions, and issues. Well, we're facing a liquid fuels crisis, but we all know that, don't we? I love this chart. Again, most of the people in the room should be familiar with this. Simply says that for the past 2 decades, the world has been consuming more oil than has been found, and the gap is growing worse. And I think this puts the problem in perspective very dramatically. You look at this for 5 or 10 seconds and say, yeah, we've got a problem, and it's not getting any better. When will oil peak? Well, again, we all know that sometime in a fairly near future, but who knows when, according to Ken DeFay's, happened last December. Some other people have forecasts within the next 3 or 4 years, including some people in the audience today. Others say that maybe it's 5 or 10 or 12 years away, 15 years away or more, which as we know, or as we'll shortly see, if it happens any time in the next 15 or 20 years, that's almost too soon to do anything serious about. What might happen at peaking? Well, again, a very simple diagram. That black dotted line indicates demand for liquid fuels progressing as a business as usual context, along with world economic growth, where oil production peaks and reach a maximum. Very quickly, we have a supply shortfall. Shortages develop, prices increase, and we have a rather serious problem. Problems that have only been glimpsed in the past, mainly the 1970s. Inflation, unemployment, stagflation, slumpflation, whatever you wish to call it, recession, high interest rates, economically the most dismal since World War II. Oil peaking impacts wouldn't last for a couple of years, 73, 74, 79, 80, could easily last for decades. It could be the world's first forced energy transition, and a point I will emphasize repeatedly, there are no quick, easy fixes. Yes, oil price increases have caused the U.S. recessions, U.S. and worldwide recessions, and likely will again in the future. Again, remember the 1970s, stagflation, recession, that was a short-term disruption. Without timely, adequate, cost-effective mitigation options initiated well in advance of oil peaking, what we experienced in the 1970s may feel, and we being not only the US but the world, may seem mild, very mild in comparison. There's a famous maximum that says that forecasting is difficult, especially when you're talking about the future. This is looking at recent EIA forecasts of the supply of natural gas in North America. You'll see what's happened just over the past 4 years, gone from very bullish, optimistic forecasts where everything looks great in the 02 annual energy outlook to the most recent one where, hey, we've got a real serious problem here in North America. Now, I don't want to pick on EIA, but these are the same people telling us not to worry about peak oil before 2030. Looking at this graph, do you believe them? I don't know. Let's say that there's reason for some cynicism. As has been mentioned, we published our first report last year. Bob Hersh was the co-author, the principal author, actually. I and several others were co-authors. It's become known as the infamous Hersh Report. We looked at world mitigation, supply and demand options, analyzed several mitigation scenarios, and developed policy implications. As a follow-on to that study, which I'll be talking about today, DOE published in July 2006 a study that doesn't look at the world, it looks at the situation for the United States in much more micro detail. We tried to assess the economic implications in the U.S., estimated the detailed impacts of mitigation options, and derived policy implications for the U.S. The objective of the study was to look at oil, liquid fuel constraints caused by import oil restrictions, peak oil mitigation, policies, implications, what have you, looking at the time required to both save and produce liquid fuels, the costs involved, the economic, fiscal, tax, and jobs impacts of these mitigation options, or conversely of not instigating timely mitigation options. In looking at the mitigation programs, we very optimistically assumed that there would be crash implementation of each of the mitigation options. They were economically and technologically feasible, essentially running as fast as you can from the start. And everything I'll be talking about here this morning is a best case, a very best case, very optimistic case scenario, which, as you will shortly see, makes the results all the more frightening, I think. We didn't assume that the options would be initiated in any specific year, because who knows if or when any of this will ever happen prior to the catastrophe happening. We just said, as we said in the study last year, that the starting date is T sub 0, and T plus 5 is 5 years after initiation, T plus 10, and so forth. T sub 0 could have been 2006. Obviously, it won't be. 2008 maybe, 2010, 2015, maybe never. Last year's study, we looked at a series of options: vehicle fuel efficiency, coal to liquids, enhanced oil recovery, heavy oil/oil sands, gas to liquids. We did not look at oil shale. In the US, we looked at a similar set of options: vehicle fuel efficiency, coal to liquids, enhanced oil recovery. We did not consider heavy oil sands, because the US resource base does not support it. Gas to liquids is not feasible for the US because we're an importer. We did look at oil shale because, as has been emphasized at this conference, the US has by far the largest resources of oil shale. The implementation assumptions for the two studies are somewhat similar. Vehicle fuel efficiency, we assumed a ramp-up, 50% increase ramped up after 8 years. That includes 3 years after legislation has been enacted to give the vehicle manufacturers time to retool, and then 5 years after that, ramping up from 0 to 50% increase. And as someone who's been involved with environmental energy efficiency groups for the past 6, 7, 8 years, trying to get this legislation enacted, it would be a miracle if anything like this happens, I think. Coal to liquids, we're looking at new plants being built, enhanced oil recovery, primarily CO2 injection, which will require the coal to liquid plants to produce the CO, because CO2, because that is what is currently limiting enhanced oil recovery. Oil shale, we're looking at new plants being built 8 years after initiation. So that's an option, even under the most optimistic scenario, is at least 8 years out after you decide to do a crash program implementation. The methodology, we used fairly well-established economic models and databases developed by my company, the Commerce Department, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Census, et cetera, industry occupation, labor skills data, and so forth. We broke the labor force requirements down to 800 occupations. We used a 70 industry disaggregation, and then did some state and regional work as well. Again, looking at not only what may be feasible in most optimistic sense for the United States, but what does it mean in terms of economic implications, job requirements, et cetera. We're basically looking at is the construction, except for vehicle fuel efficiency, which is obviously different. It's a demand reduction. On the supply side, the construction and a massive effort of coal, oil, shale, and alternative liquid fuel plants. We used, as we did in the first study, the delayed wedge model for simplification. The triangle, actually, in reality, is more like an S-shaped curve. You start out very low, you ramp up, and then you eventually taper off. The triangular wedges are just much easier to deal with and envision. This is a summary of some of our results looking at these options. From start, you don't get anything for 2 or 3 or 4 years out. With oil shale, you don't get anything substantial for 8 or 10 years out. Gradually, and then more rapidly, the energy supply or displacement increases. I want to get to another chart, but first I want to show you something that has an interesting policy implication. Notice that the vehicle fuel efficiency wedge, after about 16 or 17 years, essentially tapers off and you get no more savings from it. The reason for that is that our assumption is that we ramped up vehicle fuel efficiency standards by 50% and then held them constant. What happens is the vehicle stock, after about 15, 16, 17 years, turns over entirely, and you get no additional fuel savings. The implication here is that if by some miracle we ever get vehicle CAFE legislation, vehicle fuel efficiency legislation enacted, not only do you need a massive ramp up in the near term, but once that is done out in the 6th or 7th or 8th year, it should be written in that every year thereafter you need an additional 1 or 2 or 3% vehicle efficiency improvement on again an annual basis, which is certainly, if you believe the National Academy studies, technically feasible. This is a chart that, assuming that if we implemented these options in 2006, which of course we won't, what the savings and displacement and substitute fuel production looks like over the next 20 years through 2006. I want to spend a little time on this chart. It's not a projection, it's not a forecast, it's one of many hypothetical scenarios. We have 4 options on this chart. In related work, we've looked at a whole series of other options. For a long time, my company's been doing work in the environmental and energy efficiency area. In another study, we looked at the various biomass options, and cellulosic biomass looks a lot like the oil shale option. It's further out, and you get relatively, actually a little bit less from the biomass options than you do get from oil shale, again, making the most optimistic assumptions. We've looked at drilling in Anwar, and where you get a very little blip on the bottom. A couple weeks ago, a client called us up, asked us to look at the implications of the much-hyped Jack test, the lower tertiary Gulf of Mexico. We're looking at that. It's going to, again, be a very small blimp here, almost in the statistical noise of both requirements and other options. Next week, we start a project with ASIS, the American Solar Energy Society, to take a much more detailed look at various renewable options such as wind, photovoltaic, solar, thermal, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and so forth. The idea being here is that trying to put all, or many more of the portfolio of mitigation options in this framework. And this balance of U.S. consumption, if you haven't guessed, is the default option, which in this case is U.S. oil imports. This chart, of course, tells you that even starting 6 months ago, a massive crash program, you wouldn't come close to limiting U.S. oil imports within 20 years, if that indeed is your goal. But again, not focusing on any of these specific options, what we're trying to do here is develop a framework for which we have a lot of the modeling and data already in place, saying that for any reasonable option that someone wants to look at, being it demand side reduction, being it renewable, biomass, coal to liquids, what have you, it can be represented in this framework. How soon after initiation do you get any reasonable or substantial savings from the option? How long does it take to get 1 million barrels a day, 2 million barrels a day? What does it cost? What are the impediments? Where's the R&D? Where are the demonstration programs, et cetera? So to get away from this idea that everyone's throwing out 1 million barrels here, 2 million barrels a day, well, how long does it take? What we're finding is that any of these options, the most optimistic, no constraints, money's not an object type of scenario, take a decade before they're producing any significant savings or substitute fuels, 2 decades before you really begin to cut into U.S. consumption and oil imports. That's assuming we started, say, 6 or 8 or 10 months ago in 2006. But what if we waited a couple years? We don't know if oil peaking is going to happen in the near future, and maybe we need more R&D and assessment and so forth. This is what happens when you wait a couple of years. You're now out 20 years from now, a crash program starting in 2016. Again, it takes you 3 or 4 or 5 years to get started, and 10 years before you're really achieving any substantial savings. You really have very little impact even on total consumption, U.S. oil imports, or so forth. So waiting is deadly, and because the savings are so heavily themselves waited towards the end of the period. Waiting again is deadly. I think this chart represents it very well. I needn't dwell on it. And again, this is true not only for this small set of options we've looked at, but no option gives you, no mitigation option, either on the demand side or the supply side, gives you any appreciable oomph or kick in less than a decade. And again, the timing is of the essence. It's not only timing and cost, but the scale we're looking at here. These are the EIA projections we're using here. We believe we're going to be consuming 28 million barrels a day in 2026, 2027. That's what EIA is telling us. Domestic production continues to decline, and again, the difference here is oil imports. In the 60%, 65% today, eventually 70 or 75%, absent any serious mitigation options. All right, just looking at the options that we analyzed, after 20 years of crash program effort, these are the millions of barrels a day contributions of coal to liquids, oil shale, enhanced oil recovery, and vehicle fuel efficiency. Again, vehicle fuel efficiency is the lowest because after about 15 or 16 years, the stock of vehicles turns over and you're getting no more benefit, no more incremental benefit from the increased vehicle fuel efficiency, whereas the other options, more plants are being built each year. All 14 options after 20 years of crash effort gives you about 14 million barrels a day. Jobs created, in total it's just under 1.5 million, it's about 1.4 million, a little bit over. The different options are between 400,000 or 500,000 each. The cost data are interesting. It turns out that vehicle fuel efficiency is the least cost-effective way to address the problem. But there's a reason for these results. As I said, we've been working on vehicle fuel efficiency programs and analyses for the past 6, 7, or 8 years. We have very good data on what it's going to cost. For oil shale, coal to liquids, enhanced oil recovery, the data are much worse, and what those arrows indicate that the costs are likely in those latter three options to be easily twice what they are, because we're using nth plant costs here, which are probably ridiculously low in terms of reality. The capital costs for the supply options were based on nth plant costs, coming in the range of 2.6 trillion. Realistically, they could easily be twice this, if not more, for the simple reason that all the capital-intensive project costs are going to the roof these days for a variety of reasons. The rigs aren't there, the capital infrastructure isn't there, the manpower, the warm bodies aren't there. So the costs in the range of 4 to 6 trillion over a 20-year period. A rule of thumb, it would cost about $500 billion a year, every year for 20 years, and the kind of options we're talking about. These are representative of these 3 or 4 options. But again, looking at some of the biomass options, the other options that we've looked at in other studies, these are representative, and if anything, some of these other options are going to cost even more. It's a very expensive proposition to address oil peaking mitigation. As I mentioned, we broke down the impacts of these mitigation options on individual industries as illustrative of which industries would be impacted the most. Similarly, we did it for occupational labor and skill categories. The percentages at the top of each bar in this case are the percentage impact on the available workers in these occupations based on the latest data we have. In most cases, it's in the range of 2 or 3 or 4%. For certain specialties, it's much higher than that. As a follow-on to this, we'll be starting early next year to look at the supply-side constraints, both in terms of industry, in terms of finance, capital availability, and labor availability. I'm currently working with the national academies. There's a lot of concern, as you may have heard over the past day or two, that the human personnel infrastructure is simply not there. All the energy industries have been downsizing recently. Average age of senior people in the oil industry is in the mid to late 40s. The average age of a coal miner in West Virginia is like 56. So it's industry-wide. What I'm getting at here is that just when we may have to do crash programs in a whole number of areas, not only are we going to have a capital or an industry problem, you're going to have a very serious labor problem, which is not easily remedied. It takes 4, 5, 6 years to produce a petroleum engineer, for example, if not more, if not longer. The mitigation initiatives will, on the beneficial side, produce substantial tax revenues for the state, local, and federal governments. We estimated those, and again, any options you're spending billions and billions and billions and trillions of dollars on are going to eventually generate substantial sales for industry and generate substantial tax revenues for various levels of governments. This does not mean that they're going to pay for themselves by any means, but it is an ancillary impact. We looked at a lot of state and local data. Again, as a hypothetical example, if you located a coal to liquid plant in a specific state, these are the kind of impacts you would see. We're looking at ethanol plants in different states, biomass facilities, and so forth. We are working with a number of states that are interested in not only coal to liquids, but also ethanol plants. And they're very much interested in this type of mitigation initiative as an economic development, as a job creation initiative. In fact, you talk to state governors, state officials, and it's all jobs, 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 jobs for their state, jobs for their people, jobs for their declining rural areas, et cetera. Again, politically, it's a very powerful argument. Findings. Well, first of all, the mitigation options can contribute significantly to the saving and production of U.S. liquid fuels. It takes decades for significant impacts. Costs will be in the trillions of dollars. And again, what you're facing here, a massive scale of the problem, which I'll emphasize again shortly. But it takes decades and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, no matter which options you are looking at. It's not cheap, and it's not easy, and it's not quick. The cumulative 20-year impact would be substantial in terms of economic impacts, oil saved, and so forth. The U.S. is endowed with a lot of geological resources, capital, labor, and management necessary to undertake the effort. Whether we will in time is open to some question. The mitigation programs would obviously have security benefits, benefits to industries, creating jobs, and so forth, even help perhaps rejuvenate some U.S. manufacturing industries, and could help eliminate, at least after 20 years or so, a good fraction of U.S. oil imports. Speaking of eliminating or reducing oil imports, as part of this study for DOE, they asked us to look at the impact on oil imports, and as you know, the President has said we're addicted to oil, and we have to reduce U.S. oil import dependence. Well, I say the first thing we have to do is to stop digging. So let's forget about energy independence or reducing oil imports or reducing oil imports from the Middle East. Let's just say hypothetically we want to hold U.S. imports at 2005 level, about 13 million barrels a day. What would that require? What does it imply over a 20-year period? Well, U.S. production continues to decline gradually, and U.S. demand, according to EIA, continues to increase. So what you get that upper wedge is a supply gap. You have to fill that just to keep imports at 13 million barrels, no more than 13 million barrels a day. Well, within 20 years, actually within 18 or 19 years from 2006, what is the supply gap? It's 5 million barrels a day. That's not to reduce U.S. oil imports. That's just to keep it constant. 5 million barrels a day is something like 10 times what the nation of Australia uses in terms of oil. That's more oil than most, all but a few countries use. How is that gap going to be filled on the demand side and or the supply side, just to keep oil imports at 13 million barrels a day, which are probably not sustainable anyway. Again, it's the magnitude and the scale of the problem that is simply not recognized. People don't realize what is required and how fast, and by delaying how much worse you make the problem. As I just said, if we started on a crash program, we could reduce U.S. oil imports within 20 years, by 2025. If you delay, it becomes increasingly hopeless. This is a slide I want to spend some time on. Even before the study was officially released, it was creating controversy over the options we selected for analysis. But again, I want to emphasize the larger picture here. What we're developing here is a quantitative framework to look at the cost of benefits of liquid fuel mitigation options. We have a model and database after 3 or 4 years of effort that can include many different types of mitigation options. But again, I look upon it as a reality check. If you think that plug-in hybrids are going to solve all our problems, fine. Show us the R&D, show us the demonstration, show us the cost, show us the ramp-up. We'll put it in the model. We'll see how much you could possibly get compared to other options or compared to doing nothing, and so forth with a whole variety of options. You can look upon this from a little different perspective. What is required to maintain the current energy regime without increasing imports or with increasing imports? Current energy regime being the IEA forecast that we're consuming 21 or 2 million barrels a day today, and in 20 years it'll be 27 or 28 or 29 million barrels a day. Well, there are a lot of very serious implications of that. What are the implications of maintaining the current energy regime? Well, implications are that within 20 years you'd need a minimum of 10 or 12 million barrels a day of either demand-side savings or supply-side options. What is required to change the current energy regime? To change that from a demand or a supply side, again, you have massive amounts of substitute fuels that have to be produced or saved in some manner, and you don't have much time to do it. It also indicates the time and money required to transition to a, quote, new energy regime, presumably more sustainable, one that addresses better than we are now, environmental problems, the problems of global climate change, global warming, et cetera. It also, I think, will force us to think, excuse me, seriously about how we get from here, where we are today, or tomorrow or next year, to what I quote, say there. Where is there we want to get to? Let me take an example. Let's say that the option we really like is cellulosic ethanol. And the R&D is going to work, and the demonstrations are going to work, and we'll pour unlimited amounts of money and manpower and manufacturing capability. And there's 240 million vehicles today. 20 years from now, there's going to be 320 million, let's say. And we have cellulosic ethanol enough to, by some miracle, satisfy a substantial portion of that demand. Well, in one sense, that is a better alternative than some of the others in terms of sustainability, in terms of addressing global warming. On the other hand, it doesn't address the problem of traffic congestion, of urban sprawl, of the requirement for bridges, tunnels, highways, et cetera. Maybe there's another option. Again, where is there that we want to get to with respect to global warming, sustainability? Instead of trying to crash out on ethanol, maybe we should work on the demand side in terms of mass transit, light rail, telecommuting, flexible work schedules, bicycle paths, smart growth and development. And instead of trying to produce liquid fuels for 320 million vehicles in 20 years, maybe we should decrease the number of vehicles required, maybe down to 200 million. That would address the sustainability issue and address a lot of other environmental and land use planning and other issues. But before we can develop the options or the plans, we have to know where we want to go. And in that sense, maybe you don't want to invest in cellulosic ethanol. The bottom line is there's no easy, painless solution to these problems. Demand destruction, use less, that's a great idea. Everyone's in favor of it. from minimal disruption to recession to depression. Is demand destruction the solution or the problem? I'm arguing that it's the problem, not the solution. Fertilizer and petrochemical industries have been moved offshore. Is that a good result? Now that we're now importing petrochemicals from other countries. I'm running out of time now, but demand destruction is, and I've been in a debate for this for years, it's a euphemism for recession, depression, mass unemployment, and so forth. People in governments will not passively accept it. They'll do desperate things, invasion of Venezuela, perhaps, the scrapping of environmental protection, what have you. I think the objective should be to use the mitigation options to minimize and control, quote, demand destruction. Peak oil progress in the US, run through this very quickly, in Congress, Department of Energy, there's various task forces going. It's a start. It's better than nothing. Hopefully a lot more will be coming ahead. In conclusion, yeah, we face a problem. I hate to think about it, but in the 3 years that I've been giving these types of talks, an additional 45 or 50 million vehicles have been produced sold in the U.S. They don't get 50 miles a gallon. They get 21 or 22 million miles a gallon. They're going to last 17 years on average. You know, the longer we wait to address the problems, the faster we're going to have to run to solve them. ASPO asked me to come up with 3 policy recommendations, pretty much the same ones I've been making for the past several years. The federal government should increase vehicle fuel efficiency standards and initiate mitigation options. State and local governments should try to encourage smart growth, telecommuting, mass transit, et cetera. And all levels of governments, maybe ASPO too, should educate the public to the magnitude of the problem we face, the scale, the timing, and to solve it's going to require controversial and unpopular measures, enough to make an awful lot of people unhappy, including many people in this room. But again, the more I look at it, the more I analyze it, the more pessimistic I get. There's an awful lot of people that want to study the problem further, form committees and do whatnot and so forth. And recently, you've had a whole spate of special committees and commissions and task forces made up of former congressmen, senators, cabinet officers, CIO officials, as I call them, formerly important people, who all of a sudden discovered that we have an oil import problem. Welcome to the club, but what would you guys do for the past 20 years when you were in power and you had responsibility for programs, budget, and policy? Yeah, it might happen again, and if I was a betting man, I would say something like this probably will before we really get serious about addressing the problem, either from the demand side or the supply side, at which time it may be too late, and I'm about 40 seconds away from ending. Thank you.